Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this video is an assessment of how history will judge Robert Mugabe. So only hours ago, President Mugabe resigned his presidency, and he's not coming back. We know that he's 93 years old, probably knocking on heaven's door. Why is he gone? As you may know, a week ago the military surrounded his presidential palace. Though they were insistent it wasn't a military takeover, seemed very like one to me. So though he remained in nominal control, really the army was calling the shots. So why were these army officers compelled to do this? They'd been loyal to him for decades, throughout all the abuses, throughout wrecking the economy, throughout killing well over 20,000 civilians, through all the nepotism, all the theft of state funds. They stood by him. But push finally came to shove. Even they couldn't take it anymore. They see I was wrecking the country. I think one of the main factors was they see Emerson Mnangagwa, probably mispronouncing his name, as their man, someone who fought with them in the bush in the 70s, and they didn't want Mugabe handing over to the First Lady. Grace Mugabe is known as Disgrace by some Zimbabweans. And his own party turned against him. His cheerleaders in ZANU-PF, even they voted him out as party leader. So the Central Intelligence Organization must have been in on this, otherwise they would have tipped him off and prevented the coup d'etat happening. CIO is Zimbabwe's secret service. I was in China a few years ago and I met some young Zimbabwean students. A few of them were vociferous admirers of President Mugabe. Now why? I suppose the Zimbabwean media is like an echo chamber for his views and always giving him such extraordinary laudation. But those who could afford to study abroad, well, they're the ones who are benefiting from the regime. Presumably their parents are in the military, in the CIO, in the bureaucracy, something like that. A lot of people live in abject penury. Millions of Zimbabweans have been forced to flee abroad in order to earn a living, and I mean millions. So he's popular partly because of the fight against white domination. You may know that there was the UDI in 1965, right up until 1979. Ian Smith ruled the country, and actually for the last year there was a black prime minister, majority black cabinet and parliament. But there wasn't racial equality in that time. Certain land was set aside for whites. Only whites were allowed to own it. A white was not allowed to sell it to a black person, even if he wished to. So we know Mugabe became prime minister in 1980, and Ian Smith was briefly in his cabinet. Smith had been regarded as the Antichrist by many Zimbabweans in the 70s. We'll see how opinion changed in the 90s. But Smith had been Mugabe's deadly enemy. And in the early 80s, Smith said he was stunned. He thought maybe he'd been wrong all along. Mugabe was so sensible and was so reasonable. He was very conciliatory in the early days. He was trying to kiss and make up with the white community and some of their supporters of the black community, whilst hammering Nkomo and ZAPU, that political party, one enemy at a time. It was salami tactics. Then there was Gurukundi, when at least 1,200 civilians, maybe 20,000 civilians were killed in Matabeleland by Mugabe's forces, which the world just shrugged off as though it were not even a peccadillo. And he was still honoured by other people, by the African Union, by the Queen, given a knighthood. But there was phenomenal economic growth in the 80s. Of course there would be. The conflict was over, sanctions were lifted, there was a lot of optimism behind him, a huge amount of goodwill. People were desperate for him to succeed. Investment poured into the country. Some of the whites he'd fled in the 70s even returned. It seemed to be a model for race relations that South Africa could follow. What else then happened? Then the 90s, stagnation. But the country was still basically functioning. Only about 2000, the year about 2000, the creaking turned towards collapse. There'd been the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979. Mugabe had reluctantly gone to agree to that. He thought he could achieve outright victory in 79 if he'd fought all the way to Harare, Salisbury as it was then. But anyway, he achieved most of his goals through negotiation. One of the agreements was that there had be a willing buyer, willing seller. These white-owned farms would be returned to black people, and the British government would compensate the white farmers. But there weren't enough willing sellers, and the UK government in 1997 under Blair stopped funding the whole scheme, which was ridiculous and a breach of the Lancaster House Agreement, I think. Claire Short, the International Development Secretary, said we're a new government from diverse backgrounds. The Labour government, almost as if the Conservatives weren't from diverse backgrounds. Some of them were Jewish, that's arguably ethnic minority. Another thing about her is, well, she doesn't see that the government represents the whole of the United Kingdom, not just Labour voters. And another point, she said, I'm Irish, we're colonised, not colonisers. Well, that's bull. The surname Short, where does that come from? That's not an Irish name. She's got English ancestry, but she's an Irish Republican, despite living in England, a country she supposedly hates, thinks it's anti-Irish, and refuses to acknowledge her own English ancestry. So she's a flagrant liar. With regards to Zimbabwe, we, the Irish, were colonisers, not colonised. There were Irish people there. So there was no comparison between what had happened in Ireland and what had happened in Zimbabwe. So anyway, Blair's government helped cause this huge problem. Mugabe finally lost patience, and he had some of the war veterans simply seize white-owned farms. But rather than these going to the rural poor, dividing them up amongst small farmers, these mostly went to his henchmen. Some of them had no experience of running farms, had no wish to, and the farm soon went to rack and ruin. Pretty soon, he was rigging elections. There was large-scale violence, repression of the population, but he was canny enough not to actually outlaw opposition parties like the Movement for Democratic Change. The MDC was led by Morgan Tsvangirai, formerly a member of ZANU-PF, a miners' trades union leader, but like many people have been disgusted by pillaging of state funds, by terrible misrule under Mugabe, and that's why he'd been forced to form an opposition party. Well, Mugabe, he led a country which was quite prosperous into calamity. Was very nepotistic, wanting to shoehorn his wife into office despite having very little following in the country, wanting to hang on to the reins of office as long as possible. He's the longest serving head of state in the world, oldest head of state in the world. The Queen will probably overtake him. Now, no wonder he admired China, where they have gerontocracy, where they exalted Mao Zedong, whose face is on all the banknotes. So it's been a very lugubrious degeneration for someone who was widely seen to be inspiring throughout Africa, throughout many socialist countries around the world. There's no doubt that in 1979 he was much more popular than Ian Smith. You just look at the election results, and all right, there was some cheating by his party, but not enough to significantly alter it. By 2000, Ian Smith challenged Mugabe, said, "You and I will go to a shantytown together without any security. Only one of us will come out alive." And a lot of bad things happened under Smith's time. Civilians were deliberately killed by his forces, saying they were terrorist collaborators. And it's true that civilians quite often did act as the eyes and ears of Zanla and Zipra. And anyway, he upheld a system of legal inequality, Smith. However, the government still functioned, still did a few things for people, which by 2000 wasn't really doing. Now, Mugabe got to be fair to him. To give him his due, he did improve education. Literacy spread considerably. Apart from that, almost nothing was being done for people. A lot of people were malnourished by the end, whereas they hadn't been in the 70s. Despite the conflict, huge numbers of people had not fled abroad in search of jobs in the 70s, which by 2000 they were doing. So he has been a catastrophe for the country. A lot of people, I suppose, were very optimistic, too idealistic, had unduly high expectations in 1979 about how much he could improve things. I think some black Zimbabweans were more realistic. That's possibly why some of them supported Ian Smith, saying despite the unfairness of that system of white mastery, there was effective government. However, the old system was unsustainable because it was just so unpopular, as indeed Mugabe has become is very unpopular now. Even his own hand-picked generals have turned against him, and high time too. Sadly, I reflect there is little ground to be optimistic. Those who are perspicacious will make rather gloomy prognostications for the future. I see little hope with a person who's very likely to take over. Probably not going to be much of an improvement. Is a musical chairs coup d'etat, where they simply change the person in charge and the institutions and the policies remain largely unaffected. I expect the new president will affirm their eternal friendship with China. And this amity with China signals a lot about the kind of government he would like to run. So that's it. I think that history will not be kind to Mugabe. We'll judge him very harshly. A few early successes and then years of oppressing his people and driving them into malnutrition. So that's that. If he stood down in the early 80s after a few achievements without massacring people in Matabeleland, then the chronicles might have remembered him fondly. But as it is, he's like a despot from central casting. Good riddance. May his kind never return.